Hello, this is Katie Saint, and my PowerPoint is on some quantitative properties of anxiety, a study that bridges the gap between science and psychology. To fully appreciate this article, you need to understand the context in which it was written. At this time, psychology and science were not considered compatible. Psychology was sometimes called pseudoscience because it was too subjective and it did not meet the criteria of hard scientific study. B.F. Skinner helped bridge the gap so that psychology and science could be compatible, and this article was critical in bridging that gap. The first step in making psychology scientific was translating it to measurable terms. Anxiety, being an emotional state, resembling fear, anticipating bad future events, none of those statements are measurable. So B.F. Skinner had to put it in behavioral terms. So the way he described it was anxiety came from a prior history of learning. One stimulus was followed by a punishing second stimulus. Therefore, the temporal relations predicted a punishing event. Because of this association, the client then felt anxiety. To further explain this process, anxiety is a product of classical conditioning. S1 is paired with S2. And so through this prior training and learning, S2 followed by S1, S1 becomes the SD for S2. So a stimulus happens, and then the organism predicts that something is coming next. This conditioning process can serve as motivating operation. Physical or behavioral reactions to S1 can be measured. You can have facial expression, heart rate, or specific avoidant behavior that can be measured as a result of S1. Now that B.F. Skinner translated this into measurable terms, he wanted to replicate it in a lab. So the scientific question was, if anxiety has been translated to scientific terms, does it mean it can be produced in a lab? Or can a state of anxiety be conditioned? So he took rats in an operant chamber and he tried to produce this effect. So the procedure he followed was first 12 rats were selected and put in operant chambers. Then a tone would sound for 3 minutes, twice an hour. When the tone ended, the rat would receive an electrical shock. The study did indicate that the shock was not severe. It was perhaps uncomfortable, but it certainly did not cause any bodily harm. After there was no change in behavior from the tone, they changed it to 5 minutes. And the sound would only appear once per hour instead of twice. During this conditioning process, it did change the behavior of the rats. You can see here in the results that during the entire tone, the behavior of lever pressing stopped. These rats were hungry and they could press the lever to get food, but when the tone was playing, they would not press the lever. Lever pressing didn't begin again until after they were shocked. You'll see on the chart that there's a slight depression in how often they press the lever after the shock, but after that they made up for it, and it was even more to compensate for the depression. Some things to consider about this study include, if the rat was exposed to more conditions, would it learn the length of time of the tone and not display the behavior change for the entire length of the tone. So if they were exposed to many more trials and they were able to predict how long the tone lasts, would their behavior only change right at the end, right before they knew the shock was coming? Or would anxiety produce behavior change for the entire tone no matter what? This would be an interesting area to study. The next question includes the depression in the rate of behavior and then the compensation in the rate of behavior. These rats are hungry. They stop pressing the lever. They get shocked. They understand it's over. Why don't they immediately go to compensate and have high rates of lever pressing to make up for it? Why do they need this warm-up period of less lever pressing before they get to the compensation period? What is that phenomenon? The next question has to do with spontaneous shocks impacted the rat's behavior less than the ones that were followed by a tone. So somehow the anxiety of the tone is coming changed the behavior more than the punishing event itself. The last question has to do with hunger. So this study suggests that hunger was less powerful than anxiety. These rats were hungry, they needed to eat, but they were too anxious to eat. They stopped pressing the lever. So here, anxiety must be more powerful than hunger in this situation. Fortunately, Skinner was more ethical than Watson and Raymond in 1920 with their little Albert study. These rats' anxiety was put on extinction. The tone would sound for prolonged periods of time, and then nothing would happen. There would be no shock. So, in one condition, they had the tone, or they had complete silence for 27 minutes. And then the remainder of the hour, they played the tone the whole time with no shock at all. The responses did depress, but they did not stop as shown in the graph. Therefore, this showed that extinction was effective in making progress. They were able to reproduce this experiment 10 days later. The results gave us 4 principles that we can walk away with. Number 1, anxiety served as a larger motivator than hunger and stopped lever pressing for food. This is an interesting phenomenon because hunger is a biological need. So this anxiety was so powerful that it stopped the lever pressing. However, they did show that depending on the length of time of deprivation for food, that did have an impact on the results. So it brings up another question of, is there a point where the rat would have been so desperately hungry that it would have overcame its anxiety and still pressed the lever? But would that enter into an unethical zone where we couldn't really test it? But it was established that at the levels they did test it at, hunger was shut down by anxiety. Its needs were not met because anxiety was too powerful. The second principle is that unexpected shocks produced less behavior change than shocks that were preceded by anxiety or anticipation. So the punishing event itself produced less behavior change than the anxiety or the anticipation of waiting for it to come. That's an interesting concept as well. Third, compensation behavior always was followed by a depression. So somehow the rats always needed that warm-up period after they had stopped lever pressing during the tone, and then it would follow by a big increase to compensate for that period of deprivation. What is that phenomenon about? Lastly, Extinction of anxiety was effective. This is a big deal because this tells us that we have a treatment method for anxiety. It tells us that anxiety is predictable, it's measurable, it can be produced in a lab, it's relevant to science, and that we can get rid of it. We have a way that is proven with science in measurable terms to make it go away. This study showed both that anxiety is powerful, but also treatable. This is fantastic news in bridging the gap between psychology and science. And fantastic news for the many, many people suffering from anxiety. Here are the references for this PowerPoint. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.